If everybody can quiet down. So if you will pick up your clickers, we are going to do a test question. Some of you may be familiar with how these work, but we're just going to see if they're functioning properly and let you engage in our test question here before we actually go on to our first proposition. So our test question is, are the implications of China's growing power for global security, A, predominantly positive, B, predominantly negative, C, equally positive and negative, D, too premature to judge? Now, if you enter your answer and you want to change it, you can do that. But if you keep pressing a button, you're not going to get more than one vote. So everybody only gets one vote. And I'm going to give you maybe another 30 seconds. And if you would please enter your vote. And then when we cut off the voting here, then we will show you the results. In the past, we have had the results going up at the same time that people vote, but I think that somehow influences how people cast their own vote. So I've decided to cut off all the voting before we actually put up the final response. So everybody, a couple more seconds here.
When you vote, it does not stay lit, right?
It flashes. Yes, it will flash, but it does not stay lit. Thank you very much for that. Okay, so we will close off the voting here, and Will Colson is going to show us the results. All right, so we have 15% predominantly positive, 21% predominantly negative. We have 29% equally positive and negative, and we have 35% too, is that right? Too premature to judge, and somehow 2% that didn't like the question and decided they wanted to create their own answer.
Failed at the operation.
So I think that shows us that the clickers are working. I think there's actually maybe more people in the room than show the numbers up there. So I hope that when we start on our proposition that everybody will vote. If you think that your clicker is not working, if it's not flashing, then we do have some extra clickers that you can swap them out. But we did test them all. They should all be working. So the views are really spread out, and the predominant answer is too premature to judge. And that's a very interesting way to begin our series of debates about Chinese growing power, to see that many of you are very open-minded about where China is actually going. And so I hope that throughout the day you will remain open-minded and cast your votes on the proposition, but listen very carefully to the arguments that are being made by our presenters, and perhaps even change your vote after you hear their arguments. So, Will, if you would put up our first proposition. China can defend its sovereignty and maritime interests while tolerating U.S. military presence in Asia. So for decades, the United States has promoted stability in the Asia-Pacific, where its regional alliance network has facilitated a prolonged period of relative peace and economic development. And few countries have benefited more from the existing regional order than China. Decades of rapid economic growth have enabled China to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and invest heavily in modernizing its military. Now, what China's military prowess means for American interests in the Asia-Pacific remains unclear. Although Xi Jinping has remarked that the vast Pacific Ocean has ample space for China and the United States, there are worrying signs that friction between the two powers may increase in the coming years. Beijing has long opposed U.S. alliances in the region that facilitate U.S. military presence in waters around China. And in recent years, the Chinese government and military have more vocally criticized U.S. intelligence collection close to China's coast and U.S. freedom of navigation operations, as we heard in the first panel. So to date, China lacks the capabilities to deny the United States from operating in its near seas. And it remains debatable whether China has the ambition to do so. So before we ask our presenters to talk about their positions for and against the proposition, I'd like all of you to vote on whether you agree or disagree with the proposition. And so we will give you about 45 seconds to do that. Once again, you can change your vote if you don't like it. And while you're voting, I'm going to introduce our speakers. Again, you have the bios in front of you. To my right, Rear Admiral Mike McDevitt, who is a senior fellow with CNA in the Strategic Studies Department and has a long and respected career in the U.S. Navy. And to my left, Admiral Denny Blair, who is now chairman of the board and CEO of Sasakawa USA, former director of national intelligence, as well as former commander of Pacific Command. So we really have a terrific panel to debate this issue today. We're going to put up those results. Okay, so we have 69, is that 68 or 69? I think it's 68. 68%. Still, I think maybe some people not voting here. Okay, and we've got 32% who disagree, and we are going to start with you, Admiral McDevitt, please.
Well, thanks, Bonnie. I'm delighted to be here and contribute to the ChinaPower project. When I was asked to do this, they said, we just want you to participate in a debate, and they didn't tell me who it was against. I'm not sure I would have said yes. Given the proposition, obviously at the outset of any analysis of the proposition, you have to start with the question, which is, under what circumstances can China defend its sovereignty and maritime interests, or as the Pentagon might have it, what scenario? The wording of the proposition suggests the focus is peacetime, and that's where I'm going to start. Something that has been the norm in East Asia since 1958 in the Taiwan Straits, at the end of the Taiwan Straits crisis in Northeast Asia, and since 1975 at the end of the Vietnam War in Southeast Asia. And so obviously, since I'm debating the proposition in the affirmative, I think the answer, of course, is yes. Beijing can not only defend its sovereignty interest in the Yellow, East, and South China Seas, despite the presence of U.S. forces, it can also advance its interests in areas where its sovereignty is disputed. And to make this point, I argue that the relative balance of military power in East Asia has essentially flipped since March of 1996, 20 years and a few months ago, when President Clinton dispatched 2 carrier battle groups as a show of strength to deter attempts by Beijing to intimidate Taiwan in the lead up to its presidential election. Since that time, China has put in place and continues to improve its ability to militarily deter any direct challenges to its sovereignty claims in the East China Sea, which include both Taiwan and the Diaoyu or Senkaku Islands, and its claim to all of the land features, the islands and rocks in the South China Sea. For example, 20 years ago, when the Kitty Hawk and the Nimitz were earmarked as be the 2 carriers to show presence, China, the PLA, didn't know where those ships were. Nor did most Americans, because there was no CNN reporter on board. Today, were those 2 carriers to be dispatched, China would know exactly where they were all the time. So one of the things that has changed is over the last 20 years is that China has improved its position in each of these areas, and I'm going to talk about each of the maritime areas here. First, starting with Taiwan, which is China's most important sovereignty issue, Beijing has successfully foreclosed any hope for an independent Taiwan by keeping the use of force on the table, unless, of course, I shouldn't say foreclosed, it is foreclosed any hope for an independent Taiwan unless Beijing says it's okay with them. And has put in place a combination of missiles and air and naval and cyber capabilities to make their promise to use force, if it comes to that, a credible military threat. 20 years ago, it was more of an incredible military threat. The sad fact is that the PLA has the ability to pulverize Taiwan's air defenses and then seize air control over the strait, blockade Taiwan, and bring its economy crashing down through cyber attacks or cutting its undersea cyber link cable and essentially isolating Taiwan before the U.S. could do much about it. And in fact, China really has the ability to achieve air control over most of the East China Sea, including the Diaoyu Islands, even before the newly purchased Russian S-400 surface SAM missile system and the latest generation of Russian fighters are delivered. In the case of the Diaoyu or Senkakus 20 years ago, Japan's claim was essentially indisputable. Today, that's no longer the case. No matter what Tokyo argues, the fact is that China has, since September 2012, when Tokyo decided to purchase the islands, demonstrated on an almost daily basis that Japan's claim to sovereignty is very much in dispute. In the process, Beijing is running the Japanese Coast Guard ragged while it conducts its own version of what could be termed freedom of navigation operations in the waters around the islands to demonstrate that it can maintain administrative control over those islands. It has established an ADIZ over the East China Sea, and it demonstrated it can credibly monitor it when it chooses to do so, and in the process is causing the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force to launch hundreds of scrambles a year to monitor their own ADIZ at great cost to the Japanese, not only in terms of resources, but in wear and tear on the airplanes. It has done all of these things while tolerating U.S. presence. In the South China Sea, the story is even more interesting. Since 1974, when China ran the South Vietnamese out of the Western Paracels, Beijing has successfully pursued a deliberate, patient, but inexorable strategy to gain control over all of the land features in the South China Sea, features it considers its sovereign territory. In 2012, it gained effective control over Scarborough Shoal. All it is left to do in its sovereignty quest is in the Spratly Islands. Now, this is a tough nut to crack, because how does Beijing evict the Filipinos, the Vietnamese, and the Malaysians from the Spratly features these countries occupy without starting a war? So, to this end, one of the things that China has done is construct 7 large island bases in the Spratlys. These island bases have altered the balance of power in the southern half of the South China Sea, an area that previously was beyond the PLA's routine reach, no longer. In fact, for the first time, Beijing now has the ability to bring land-based air power in significant numbers to the southern half of the South China Sea. Thanks to CSIS's AMTI website and what have you, there's the possibility that 3 regiments of fighters could be stationed on the 3 islands that have long runways, and that means 72 fighters could be in the southern half of the South China Sea. This, along with expansive harbor facilities, its Paracel Island bases, and its mainland ballistic missiles, means the PLA now has the ability to credibly argue it can command any air and sea approaches to China that come via the South China Sea. In peacetime, these bases provide Beijing with the ability to monitor air traffic through the southern half of the South China Sea and over much of Southeast Asia, enforce fishing regulations dictated by Beijing, and otherwise harass the fishermen of the other littoral states. If it comes to that, use force against non-U.S. allied states. In sum, over the last 20 years, China has been very successful in not only successfully defending its sovereignty claims, it has peacefully improved its position in all three areas. Perhaps most importantly of all, it has made huge strides in the most important sovereignty issue of all, defending China from an attack from the east, its seaward approaches. Arguably, for the first time since the 18th century, today, China has the ability to credibly defend itself from an attack from the sea, despite the presence of U.S. Forces in the region. 20 years ago, the U.S. could assume it had sea and air control wherever it operated in the Western Pacific. While the U.S. still has the ability to sail and fly where international law permits in peacetime, that exists today, but in wartime, thanks to the PLA's A2 and AD defense concepts, and we can talk about that in the Q&A if you want to go in more detail, the United States will have to both fight to gain sea control and then have to fight to maintain sea control and air control, to maintain it. Apparently, DOD shares this opinion because not more than within the last month on this very stage, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Bob Work, talked about the third offset strategy, and he said the main purpose of DOD's third offset strategy is to restore, and important, remember the word restore, conventional deterrence, conventional extended deterrence. In other words, the U.S. can't guarantee that it can deter a conventional attack in the region. That's what that implies to me. So, as I say, this is the subtext of where DOD is going now. So this means that China can confidently continue to focus on the gradual improvement of its sovereignty claims by using so-called gray zone operations without having to worry too much about the 20-odd warships of the U.S. 7th Fleet and the fighter wing in the 5th Air Force in Okinawa. If you look at the numbers, for example, the U.S. today has around 260 blue water capable ships. I'm not counting the minesweepers and all of that, but it's about 260 warships, if you will, submarines and warships. So 60% of that number of ships, when they're supposed to be assigned to the Pacific Fleet. That means 156, roughly. So right now, China, within the next year or two, is going to have around 265 ships. Almost all of those home-ported in China. Now, qualitatively, the United States has far superior ship for ship, but numbers do matter. And remember, only 20 of those ships are permanently in the Western Pacific on any given day, or 20-odd, or some of them. Most of them are thousands of miles away in U.S. bases in Pearl Harbor, west coast of the United States, and the other half of the U.S. Navy is on the eastern, home-ported on the East Coast. So it's important to keep in mind that China is playing the home game, and the United States is playing the away game. And the advantages that come from being the home team will continue to dramatically improve. So yes, China can defend its maritime interest while tolerating U.S. presence in the region. Thank you.
Great. Now, arguing against the proposition, Admiral Blair, you have your work cut out for you. Only 32% have argued against this so far.
Well, thanks, Monty, for inviting me. Good to be on a stage with an old comrade in arms, Admiral McDevitt. And it's a great pleasure to channel the Chinese arguments that I've heard for many years on this proposition. I've generally been on the other side of the debate, so it's a pleasure to be on this side this time. So as Admiral McDevitt said, in all debates, a great deal depends on the definition of the terms that are involved. China can defend its sovereignty and maritime interests while tolerating U.S. military presence in Asia. So what is meant by defend? Is that victory in combat, should it come to that? Or is it the confidence of military superiority in peacetime? What is meant by sovereignty and maritime interests? The prevailing UN Convention on Law of the Sea definitions of maritime rights, which was fashioned by the traditional maritime nations of NATO, including the United States, or something more like the Monroe Doctrine, which is also a creation of the United States. And what is meant by U.S. military presence? Is that simply the stationing of U.S. forces in Japan and in Korea? Or is it the aggressive operations that China has seen of American forces along China's coasts? So at the heart of this discussion is the question of whether it is China's definition and understanding of these concepts that is important, or the American definition and understanding. And if Admiral McDevitt thinks that the current contested military situation along China's maritime borders is satisfactory from China's point of view, then he simply doesn't understand the way that they think about it, and the way that they think about it is the most important factor here. It makes no sense for other countries to reassure China that they pose no threat to it, that the balance of military power is not so bad, if the Chinese leadership and the Chinese people do not feel that way. And we are often told that the 1.3 billion Chinese people simply don't feel that way. So to China, it simply does not feel safe for the United States to be able to operate aircraft carriers and fly bombers that could potentially carry nuclear weapons as close as 12 miles off of China's coast, as provided by the current American-inspired interpretation of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And it's not enough for China that the U.S. protests its peaceful intentions in addition to citing this international convention that it itself has not ratified. After all, it was less than 70 years ago that the United States threatened nuclear attacks on China in confrontation over the offshore islands of Quemoy and Matsu. It had plans to launch those nuclear attacks from bases in Taiwan and from aircraft carriers off the waters of China. Even in more recent times, American deployments of military force in the waters near China have included the implicit threat of force against what China considers its maritime interests and possibly even its territory. Admiral McDevitt mentioned the two carrier battle groups that were deployed towards China in March of 1996, and he himself said that China was not able to understand the location of these carrier battle groups and quite naturally felt extremely threatened by them. 14 years later, in 2010, the United States sent the George Washington carrier battle group into the Yellow Sea in reaction to the North Korean sinking of the Chonan and shelling of offshore islands. And American officials in their statements made it clear that they were exercising what they termed freedom of maritime maneuver against China. And to the Chinese, this looked like the real reason for the deployment, not some sort of little threat from North Korea. At that time, China stated in the authoritative People's Daily, China does not object to the presence of the U.S. Navy in the Western Pacific and understands that some countries need the U.S. military to provide them with a sense of security. But this does not mean that the United States can ignore China's self-esteem and drive their aircraft carriers straight up to the front door, straight up to China's doorstep to flex their muscles. 3 years later, in 2013, when China declared an air defense identification zone in the East China Sea, a concept that the United States itself invented in 1950 and uses freely around its borders, the United States sent a pair of B-52 bombers through that airspace without the courtesy of notification. So the Chinese conclusion is that from the earliest days of the establishment of modern China, the United States has taken advantage of its interpretation of maritime rights to maneuver its naval and air forces close to China to threaten China. And so long as this sort of activity continues, China will never be secure. Yes, it has built up its own naval, air, and missile forces that can attack American forces as they approach China. And this defensive military power provides some measure of reassurance, but only if the American forces in Asia are gone and if its deployments into the East Asian region are infrequent and small, will China actually be secure on its maritime borders. Now, beyond all these legal definitions of obscure points of maritime law, the Chinese have two basically common sense suspicious reactions and objections to these American activities that are close to their maritime border. First, they're threatening. Why would the Americans act like this unless they were considering military attacks on China? China's a peaceful country. Its plans, its exercises, its military forces are only for defensive purposes. China has no plans to threaten American territory and American forces unless they attack China. But the Americans use these terms like preparation of the battlefield. They openly acknowledge that they have war plans to fight China in Asia, and they conduct exercises to perfect those plans. Now, second, the American presence and operations on China's maritime border are basically unfair, since China conducts no similar activities along America's maritime borders. China believes that it is seeking no more security for itself than what the United States itself already enjoys. So let's turn to this concept of the U.S. military presence in Asia. To the Chinese, it makes no sense that the American military presence in Asia did not change at all when the Cold War ended, although the entire basis for that presence for half a century had been to contain the Soviet Union. The Chinese noticed that in Europe, when the Cold War ended, roughly 2/3 of forward deployed American forces were withdrawn back to the United States during the 1990s. Yet in Asia, there was no change to American force levels. And this is what the Chinese mean when they talk about a Cold War mindset on the part of the Americans. The United States seems to think that it has to keep forces wherever it can around the world, always ready, and to be able to use them aggressively on whatever pretext is convenient for it at the time. And in fact, since the Asia rebalance was announced, the United States has increased both the number and the quality of its forces that threaten China from close by. The U.S. arguments that it is reacting to a military threat from China simply do not seem plausible to the Chinese. Chinese force development in the past decade it considers completely defensive. China, after all, has not developed a capability to project force, no buildup of large-scale, self-sustainable amphibious forces, no buildup of the capabilities to sustain maritime power at distances from Chinese borders, no large airborne forces, massive refueling capabilities such as the United States has. These are the elements of projection power, and China is simply not building any of them. So what's the United States worried about? Why is it maintaining the forces that it needed against the Soviet Union and then even increasing their capability after the Soviet Union has gone? How can China be secure in the face of this increasing American capability on its maritime borders? Now, in the past, China gave some credit to the notion that the American presence was restraining its allies who might otherwise threaten China themselves, that the United States was the cork in the Japanese bottle. However, that's no longer the case. In fact, it seems to Chinese that the American presence in East Asia, the very presence of the United States forces stationed there, is encouraging aggressiveness against China. That's certainly true in the case of Japan. Consider the Senkakus, in which Japan has altered its force structure, built up its projection power capability, and the United States has supported that Japanese buildup and says that the defense treaty applies to the Senkakus. And it's support from the United States that's encouraging the Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia to insert their claims against China much more aggressively in the South China Sea. Yes, China China's actions in the South China Sea have been of a larger scale than the other countries, but you forget, China is a large country. These are little capabilities, and that's a fact. They're little countries, and that's a fact. Little capabilities, too. All right. So, rather than being a force for stability and peace in Asia, American forces stationed and operating there have been the reason for anti-Chinese actions by many other countries in the region. So China's security will not be assured until the United States withdraws its forces from the region, and the countries there adjust to the reality of China's dominant role in the region. China will never use its military force against these countries. China does not invade other countries, but it has a right to be acknowledged as the largest and most powerful nation in the region, and a right that these smaller countries do not plan for or conduct hostile acts against China. China, in this regard, seeks no more security than the United States already enjoys as a dominant country in its part of the world. And the sooner that happens, the better. Thank you.
So I've not worked into the program any formal rebuttal, but I am going to give both of our speakers an opportunity if they do wish to address any of the issues that the others raised. But what I'd like to do is to include all of you in the discussion to help sharpen this debate a little bit. So I will take a few questions, and then we will allow our speakers to address them, and in the course of doing so, to also address any of the issues that have been raised by the other speaker that they wish to do so. So once again, I'd ask you to wait for the microphone and identify yourselves, and please ask a question and make it concise. So let me start with this gentleman with the glasses right there. And the microphone should be coming to you. Thank you, sir.
Good morning. Brigadier Saforion, Reserve from the IDF, from the INSS in Tel Aviv. How do you interject, by the way, you're both serving the same logic, like do it softly but insist and persist. How do you interject the domestic game into these calculi?
I didn't understand the question.
Domestic factors in China, you mean? Or in all countries? Okay.
Both States and China. Okay, we'll take another question. Looking for some women here. In the back.
Hi, Augustus Alzona, a longtime immigrant from the Philippines we've watched presidents come and go from both countries, including this one, since 1955 when we first moved into D.C. My question for either one of you gentlemen is, what would you do militarily regarding China, vis-a-vis our relationship with China, if you were President Trump?
Somehow I knew that there were going to be lots of questions about policy in the Trump administration. Okay, so we'll take one last one. Okay, so we have this gentleman in front here, and please wait for the microphone.
Thank you. Ken Meyercord, World Docs. Why do you suppose we included the Senkakus under the Mutual Defense Pact with Japan when the Senkakus were not under Japanese control at the time the pact was signed, and we're the ones who turned them over to Japanese control?
I can do that too.
Okay, Admiral McDevitt, you want to start?
Oh, okay. Domestic factors. In the United States, think back over the last 2 years about the steady drumbeat of criticism of the Obama administration and not being tough enough in the South China Sea. And Senator McCain from the Hill saying we need to do something, and the thing they lighted upon was, let's do freedom of navigation operations. And so the administration in many ways was forced by domestic pressure if you consider Capitol Hill as a reflection of domestic pressure, to do something that probably was legally very awkward and use a freedom of navigation almost as a deterrent operation and kind of skew the notion of what freedom of navigation operations were supposed to be about, which is protesting an excessive claim. The trouble is, of course, is China has never made an official claim to any, in terms of around the Spratlys, except the land. They've claimed the features, and obviously all of the maritime entitlements that would go with those features. And so, I think domestic pressure had a huge impact on the courses of action that the Obama administration elected to use in the South China Sea. And the critics, of course, weren't satisfied. We still weren't tough enough. But that was generally, I think, very much driven by domestic pressure. I have others too, I'm sorry. China and President-elect Trump. I think the smart answer is nobody knows for sure. But if you listen to what he has said on the campaign trail about being tough on trade, that certainly is not going to improve the atmosphere. And the Republican Party has traditionally been stronger on support for Taiwan than the Democrats. And so there is a possibility that there'll be members of the Trump administration who will be much more aggressive in wanting to support Taiwan. With the DPP in power on the island, that will also contribute, I would argue, to a more difficult U.S.-China relationship. And so and whether President-elect Trump would choose to pick any fights in the South China Sea, I doubt it. Our interests aren't that great. But certainly you can see that the atmosphere between Beijing and Washington could become much more difficult than it is today. And the Senkaku issue, I think the argument that the United States made is, remember, we didn't leave Okinawa and the Ryukyus until 1972. So the war had been over. We'd been there almost 30 years, and the Senkakus were considered part of that under Okinawa U.S. administration, if I'm not mistaken. And then the argument was it was returned to Japan, administrative control. We were on the verge of agreeing to Japanese sovereignty, but the Republic of China, who was still an ally at the time, rolled in during the ratification debate on the Hill, and the U.S. position changed to one of just returning administrative control.
So, Admiral Blair, I'd like to turn to you for your responses to the same questions and perhaps add one as well. So if President Trump adopts a tougher trade policy, builds the U.S. Navy, continues to be challenging China's interests in the South China Sea, and maybe even strengthens them in some ways rhetorically, perhaps with the Philippines, as we have a alliance relationship. And I know you have advocated that the administration actually take a position of that the Philippines has sovereignty over Scarborough Shoal. So if some of these steps were taken, looking at it from China's perspective, does that then make China more or less willing to tolerate U.S. military presence in Asia?
But yeah, I don't think the domestic factor is very complicated in the politics of either the United States or China. You can't appear weak. That's kind of the overwhelming domestic pressure that operates on any political administration. Mercifully, the security aspects of the U.S.-China relationship have not bulked large in the campaign. We have nothing that we saw, for example, back in 1992 with butchers of Beijing rhetoric, or with a big sale of F-16s to Taiwan just before the election, and that's been a good thing. The primary, as Bonnie's question says, the primary way that China's American relations with China have played in the election have been in the trade area. And although there is some overlap in trade and security issues, they've been pretty well compartmented by the two countries, and I would see that they could continue to be compartmented, and I think that would be to the advantage of both the U.S. and China. But let me sort of revert a little bit to my debate role, and I would tell you that I don't believe everything I'm about to say, but I think it's useful for purposes. I think the President-elect Trump's deal-making instincts could have a field in the East China Sea. Let's imagine what a deal could be between China and the United States in the security area that would put some reality into this idea that the Pacific is big enough for both the United States and China. Now, I think when most Chinese, the understanding of most Chinese of that phrase is the dividing line ought to be about Honolulu. You know, United States take Honolulu east, and China take Honolulu west, and that's how we both can live in the Pacific. That's completely intolerable to the United States, of course. But let's imagine a deal that you could reach in East Asia, within the first island chain, among America's allies, that might be to the advantage of both countries. I'd say the first part of that deal would be that shipping would be off limits. We would formally or informally agree that all of this talk about cutting off oil shipments to China or blockading shipments to Taiwan and all would be something that both countries would not resort to, that neither would interfere with, even in conditions of conflict, with the lifeblood of economic development in the region, which has benefited all countries. As for peacetime activities, I would say that the deal would be that the United States would sharply reduce, if not eliminate, its reconnaissance activities, surface and air, off of Chinese coasts, and would notify China in advance of exercises that would take place in that area. China, for its part, would not further militarize any of the features that it claims, whether in the South China Sea, Spratlys, or Paracels, or the vicinity of the Senkakus. And China, for its part, would also notify the United States of military exercises that it intended to conduct. Both sides, of course, would still be able to respond to crises. Both sides would be able to transit through the area with military forces for their own purposes. But basically, activity outside of that would be a breaking of this agreement and would signal something serious and would mean that the other side would probably retaliate. So if you were of a deal-making disposition and coming into the American administration, I think something like this would be what you would think about in terms of China. Again, let me emphasize, since this is an open forum, that this is not what Dennis Blair advocates or is about to write an op-ed article on, but in the spirit...
For all you reporters out there, let's not publish this as Admiral Blair's views.
In the spirit of the debate, I would say that such a deal might be something that would be interesting for both sides to consider.
This is just saying, right? Could I address the issue?
Yes.
Bonnie asked about the Scarborough Shoal. I, too, have suggested what Denny did in terms of extending the mutual defense treaty with the Philippines to cover Scarborough Shoal as a deterrent. That was before President Duterte took the initiative to pursue bilateral negotiations with Beijing over Scarborough. So I don't think any U.S. government, be they the remaining days of the Obama administration or the Trump administration, would take that step now. That would be unduly provocative, I would judge. But that's something that Washington has in its back pocket, because if you look at the actual merit, the legal merits of whether Scarborough is Philippine sovereign territory versus Chinese sovereign territory, it's easy to come to the judgment that Scarborough is Philippine sovereign territory, and hence the mutual defense treaty would apply.
We have a few more minutes, take a few more questions before we vote for one last time on the proposition. Okay, so Chris Nelson and then John Zhang. At the front table, please.
Thanks so much, Bonnie. Chris Nelson, also report on Sasakawa Peace Foundation. Thank you, Dennis, for giving me a safe haven. In listening to this, I'm reminded that back in 2010, Hillary Clinton went to the Hanoi ARF, and in many ways precipitated what in Chinese minds are the start of the various crises. And what we've never really heard from the Chinese is that Hillary was responding to not domestic constituent pressure, but allied constituent pressure, and that's the continued factor. And I think if I'm looking for a bridge between the two admirals, it's the role of U.S. alliances in the future. If we're going to be making deals with the Chinese or not making deals with the Chinese, it isn't just us. And that's where trade comes in. That's where the pivot psychologically comes in. It's where the TPP failure comes in. All these things. The key to try to resolve this knot of what is really acceptable to the Chinese and what are our minimal demands seems to be how do we get, what is it that our allies really want from us, and what will they really support from us? So I'd like to hear a little more discussion from the two admirals on that point. How much of too much FON is too much? If you stop it, oh my God, you're pulling out. You know, we've heard this for 40 years, right? So is there a happy medium that can be worked out with the Chinese, and that feeds into the point that Admiral Blair was making for the just saying point of a possible deal that we could negotiate. So thanks.
Okay, and over here, John Zhang.
John Zhang with CTI TV of Taiwan. Admirals, thank you. Admiral McDevitt mentioned the 1996 Taiwan Strait crisis and the two U.S. carrier groups, and what China has done since then. Will this fact impact any U.S. calculus in terms of U.S. reaction to another possible Taiwan Strait crisis? Will this have any influence on President Trump's calculus in particular? Should we see another Taiwan Strait crisis? Thank you. And Admiral Blair knows this very well, has spoken on this in the past, and I want to hear your thoughts too, please. Thank you.
Admiral Blair, you want to start?
I don't think my view on this has changed. The U.S. reaction on a Taiwan crisis would depend how it started. If there were unprovoked military attack by China on Taiwan, just because they were tired of screwing around with non-military ways and they were going to solve this once and for all. This was somewhat hinted at by former President Jiang Zemin, that he was going to solve it by one means or another by the end of his time as General Secretary. If that happens, then I think the United States would and should assist Taiwan to repel that attack and restore the status quo. Restoring the status quo would be disastrous for China, of course, in that case, having rolled the dice on a military adventure and not succeeding. It calls the whole regime into question. However, I think we learned also during some other administrations in Taiwan that if Taiwan tries to shield behind the United States and advance towards de jure independence by clever declarations and visits and all of that, then I think Taiwan's kind of on its own, and the United States would not react quickly or perhaps decisively. So it kind of depends on the way the crisis goes down.
To Chris's question, and Danny may want to chime in too here, what do the Allies want? I don't think there's any mystery on that, Chris. Our friends and allies in the region don't want us to get into a fight with China. They don't want to be in the middle of a Sino-US war or even bad relations. They don't want to have to choose. They want to be those who are reaching out to the United States want us to be there to be an over-the-horizon force, if you will, because who else can possibly balance China? But by the same token, they also recognize that their economic dependence on China, they need China more than China needs them. And so they just don't want either country to do anything stupid. In terms of the issue of Taiwan, Admiral Blair captured it, in my views, exactly in the sense of it depends upon how it starts. The difference, I think, in terms of how the U.S. chose to react to a provocation and the thinking that went into it, I think, would be very different. 20 years ago, sailing two carrier groups around and making threatening noises was kind of, wasn't too hard to do. Nobody was worried too much about what the PLA might be able to do. Today, as I suggested, that at least the Deputy Secretary of Defense thinks that we are on the verge, or not on the verge, we have to restore our ability to provide a credible deterrent, which means riding to the rescue. So planners would have to take into consideration the threat of doing anything. Because all of a sudden, if they know where the ships are, that means they know where to send submarines, that means they know how to where to target missiles, and what have you. So the amount of risk that the U.S. would have to absorb would be very much higher, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would only add a process point to what Admiral McDevitt said on the Allies' objectives, which are to not for the United States and China to be in a confrontation, but also not to sell out their interest as allies by some sort of a G2, some sort of a U.S.-China direct relationship. The abiding fear in Tokyo and Seoul of being simply 30,000 feet under the American delegation flying into China to negotiate is real. So I think there's a process point in dealing with our allies, which is we talk to them ahead of time about anything that we do with China. So that fanciful deal that I sketched out, of course, would be discussed thoroughly with allies ahead of time to make sure that they know that this is not a selling out of the American security guarantee to them, that it in fact would enhance it by lowering the military temperature in the region. So I think there is a substantive point, and there also is a process point here for alliance management.
And of course, on the Taiwan question, bringing us back to our debate, I think China's strongest objection to U.S. military presence in Asia really does stem from the potential that the United States would, in fact, intervene and defend Taiwan if China were to try to seize it militarily. So I don't know whether we've sharpened this debate enough, but we are going to vote again one last time to see if any of your views have changed. Once again, the proposition is China can defend its sovereignty and maritime interests while tolerating U.S. military presence in Asia. And please vote whether you agree or you disagree with the proposition. And I'll give you about another 30 seconds. And then we will see if people's views on this have changed as a result of our debaters.
Yeah, 177.
That's right. Last time we had 177 votes, so we'll see. Hopefully we'll have at least as many this time. Maybe people were unsure and they wanted to listen to the arguments first. All right, we are going to close the voting and put up the results. So previously it was 68% that agreed with the proposition. We are now down to 59%. And those disagreeing with the proposition have increased from 32% to 41%. So we still have had a significant change in views.
Yeah, I want to recount too. He beat me to it.
Well, I think we've had a great debate, so please join me in welcoming and thanking Admiral Blair and Admiral McDevitt. We're going to move directly into our next debate, if you will, and ask Professor Aaron Friedberg and Professor Zhao Shui-Sheng to come up. You may take your water. We're going to have one more proposition, one more debate, and then we're going to break for lunch, so I'd appreciate it if people, if they can, stay in their seats. Professor Zhao, you can come up here and